Brilliant. Right, so good morning again. My name is Lauren Cadwalder. I'm working at the Office of Scholarly Communications. I've met a few of you before. I have been working in the Open Access team. I now work in the Research Data team, and I'm quite a fan of metrics, or at least learning all about them. So I've got a webinar for you today. It's not quite in the format that Claire usually uses because we had to have a bit of a last-minute switch around. So there'll be a few questions. There'll be a little bit of interactivity, might be some off the cuff, but please just bear with me. So I've got a question for you all to start with. And that's, do you use metrics? So it's just a little poll on the side, just to try and gauge your level of, do you use metrics? Do you know what they are? Not sure, just so I can have a little bit of understanding of my audience today. So we've got people who don't use metrics at the moment. That's good. Hopefully I can give you a bit of an understanding of what they are and how to use them. Okay. So today's talk will cover kind of what are metrics and why are they important, bibliometrics and altmetrics, what they are, how we might be able to use them, the pros and cons of using them, and how you might apply using metrics. There's a clicking along document that has some of the links that I'll be talking about today, which you can access anytime. It's a Google Doc, it'll stay up on the web, so you can go back to it again and again. I'll just put the link in the chat box. There you go, that's the link there. Hopefully it should work. And so you can click along and explore the resources as we go. So what are metrics, first of all? Well, infometrics is a study of quantitative aspects of information. That's a kind of formal definition. Again, academic research, the kind of infometrics breaks down to bibliometrics and altmetrics. And these are, I say, basically quantitative aspects of recorded information about research outputs. So that's stuff you can record about research outputs that we can then do research about. So we can contrast and compare, see if one thing's better than another, do kind of some statistics on them. So there, as I was saying, there's altmetrics and bibliometrics. I'm just going to think about why are they important. Right, so can anyone in the chat box tell me why they think metrics might be important? Anyone have any ideas why using metrics might be useful? So to assess the impact of research, yeah, I agree with that one. Help improve the value impact of research, yeah. Okay, so we're getting lots of kind of measuring impact for the ref, and I definitely agree with that. So generally used to analyse research and judge the quality of research. So that's the kind of the ref angle of it. But also there are a number of other reasons why they're kind of important in use to analyse research. So they might be used to make hiring decisions, and this is especially true in the US, that metrics are used to help assess candidates when they're kind of hiring and firing and making tenure track decisions. They might be used to decide on strategic priorities, so the university might use them at a kind of quite a high level to decide where to put concentrate their research funding and concentrate their activities, so whether to support one unit more than another, or give different departments more money than others. Researchers might use them to decide where to publish as well, because they're used to make hiring decisions and judge the quality of the researchers are aware of that. And so they might use the metrics because they're thinking about their work being judged further down the line. And librarians might use them to decide what journals to buy. So there was a big report that came out in 2015 by HEFCE, so there's a Higher Education Funding Council for England, which is kind of the UK government council that deals with higher education. And it's called the Metric Tide. And it's available at that link there. And it really did a big review over how metrics are used in research and to assess research. And it had lots of recommendations about how metrics should be used, and especially how metrics might be used around the next ref. And I'll spoil the ending for you, I suppose. They basically decided that actually metrics are really tricky, that they shouldn't be used in isolation, and that they should be used kind of within full knowledge of what they are and how they're calculated and how they should be used. Because actually, if you just use one metric, you only get one side of the story, and that can actually be quite dangerous when it comes to assessing research and giving it some kind of value, especially monetary value. And so actually the metric tide cautioned against using metrics kind of willy-nilly, but they should be used with kind of full knowledge of what that metric means and in the context of other indicators. So I'm going to talk about bibliometrics first of all. So I'm going to cover both types of metrics and just explain to you what they are and how you might use them. So bibliometrics are statistical analysis of written publications used to provide a measurable analysis of academic literature. So these are probably things you're quite familiar with. They're taking, they're putting a kind of value on a written publication, or they're trying to assess it by looking at numbers, such as numbers of downloads and numbers of citations, and trying to use that to quantify the academic literature. So before I tell you different types of bibliometrics, I've got another poll for you, which is name me a metric. It's not quite a poll, I suppose, it's an open question. So do you know any metrics? Does anyone know any typical names? Have come across any? Any ways you might analyse publications? Citation index, yeah, that's one metric. Journal impact factor, that's another one. I guess they're kind of the top two. Download figure, yeah, that's another one. So that's kind of the less traditional, kind of as we move into the digital world. Any others? Okay, so I'll give you, I'm just going to talk about a few today. So, go back to my slideshow. So some examples. So journal impact factor, as someone pointed out in the poll. There's also something called the eigenfactor, which is an alternative to the journal impact factor. There are a few alternatives, so I'm just going to talk you through one of them today, or actually two of them today, because I'm also going to talk you through the Simago journal rank. And I'll talk about the differences between those different metrics and why one might be more appropriate than the other. And they're all journal level metrics, so they're assessing the kind of the journal. Whereas you get things like citation analysis and the H index, and these are article or researcher level metrics, so they're assessing a kind of more granular at the more granular level. Now, there are also loads of different type of metrics, and there are more and more new metrics coming up. Indeed, on the mailing list about bibliometrics, there was another new metric announced the other week, something like the S index, or the S rank, I think, where some researchers have come up with a new way of assessing kind of the journal level metric. And they do this because actually no metric's perfect. There are kind of pros and cons of each, and there are caveats with all of them. And so they're trying to assess different ways that we can analyse academic research, and some are more appropriate than others. New ones come up, but we'll see if they catch on. The journal impact factor took a long time to catch on, so if new metrics don't catch on for a long time, you know, I wouldn't be worried. It doesn't mean they're no good, it just means that everyone's probably a bit set in their ways. So I'm going to start talking about the impact factor. So what does it measure? This is the first question. Don't worry, this isn't a poll. It measures how often papers in a particular journal are cited on average over the preceding 2 years. So it looks at kind of all the papers that are published in Nature, and then has a look at how often they're cited or were cited 2 years before. It's used to measure the importance or rank of a journal. So it's one of the kind of more, I was going to say more popular, but maybe more prevalent metrics, more correct. And it's really been used to assess the importance or rank, and a lot of researchers, especially in the STEM fields, regard it really highly. So it's calculated. So this is an example of how it's calculated. If we're looking at the 2012 impact factor, we could do a little simple sum. A over B equals 2012 impact factor, where A is the number of times an article published in 2010 and 11 was cited by index journals in 2012, and B is the total number of citable items published in 2010 and 2011. Now each metric will kind of define its citable items in different ways. Some of them might include review articles, some might not. So this is a caveat for all the different metrics, is you kind of need to understand actually what it's counting, what it's including. Does it include things like letters to the editor, protocol papers, that kind of thing when it's doing its count. Quite often it's difficult to find these out because some of the metrics are kind of proprietary, they're owned by different companies. So the impact factor was owned by Thomson Reuters and it's now owned by Clarivate. And so sometimes it's quite hard to find out actually what their full methodology is. Traditionally, it's based on a kind of a 2-year count. There's also a 5-year score, kind of recognition that that some subjects take longer to cite papers than others. I'm just going to show you kind of an example of different impact factor scores for zoology journals, so the top 10 zoology journals in 2015. And on the left-hand side is the 2-year impact factor, and on the right-hand side is the 5-year impact factor. And you can actually see a few differences just taking that different time frame into account. That the more or less the same journals are within the top 10 on both sides of the table, but there are some quite interesting differences, I think. And they're the kind of the journals that have highlighted on the table. So if we look at Hystrix, which is number 4 in the 2-year impact factor, and if you look at the 5-year impact table, it actually falls to number 19, which is quite a big drop. And if you look at the integrated computational biology and the organic diversity and evolution, I think it is, on the 5-year impact factor, there's scores number 7 and 8, and actually they drop down to 11 and 36 if you just look at the 2-year impact factor. So if you're using the impact factor to kind of pick out top 10 journals or research that's published in a really high-ranking journal, depending on whether you use the 2-year or the 5-year impact factor, could actually have a big difference for some of the journals that you use. So there are pros and cons to everything, as I was saying. One of the pros of the impact factor is that actually it's very commonly used, and it's a metric that people understand, especially in the STEM, which means that people are familiar with it, and it's more likely to influence academic practice. So actually, if you're talking to researchers about metrics, they're more likely to kind of understand what you're talking about when you talk about the impact factor. So you have a bit of traction there with the audience. It also has a long-standing history, which feeds back into the familiarity, and it's used to track the journal's importance or impact over time, which is really good if you're taking the kind of long-term view. So actually, you can look at, if you're assessing research that was published, say 5 or 10 years ago, you can go back and look at the impact factor then, because it could be that journal has dropped in the rankings, but 5 or 10 years ago, it was a great journal. So at the time, it was marvelous research. That's not to say that the impact factor is the only way to score marvelous research. So there are cons as well to the impact factor. One of the big questions is it fit for purpose? The impact factor was actually invented in the, I think, 60s, and it was invented to help librarians decide which journals to buy. It wasn't invented to rank research or to give importance to particular journals. It was designed with a completely different purpose, but now its kind of sole purpose in life seems to be ranking research. And really it's ranking the vessel, so it's ranking the journal, and it's not ranking what's inside that, it's not ranking the articles. So you could have a journal that's full of really great articles and one really terrible article, but if you're using the impact factor to assess the articles, you just, and it's got a high impact factor, even though a really rubbish article, you can go, wow, it must be amazing research because of the impact factor, whereas the impact factor is judging the vessel. It also doesn't account from where the citation comes. So it's measuring citations, and your paper might have 100 citations, but they might all be from like the journal that nobody reads. So actually, what good is it if someone's citing your paper but no one's reading that citation? Whereas someone else might cite a paper and they're citing it in the journal that everybody reads. So actually lots of people will be exposed to that citation. So you might argue, and we'll look at the eigenfactor in a minute, that actually it's quite important where that citation comes from, because if someone's citing it in a really popular journal that lots of people read, more people will be exposed to that work and they're more likely to go and read it. Whereas if there's lots of citations coming from the journal of rubbish stuff that no one reads, people aren't really going to read that, and they aren't going to be exposed to your work. It can't really account for journal growth, so because it's got a really simple denominator and whatever the other one is, my GCSE maths is failing to return to me, that actually if a journal suddenly expands and publishes a lot more citable items, then that really simple fraction, the bottom number gets increases a lot, so it means that the overall impact factor drops down. But actually the number of articles it published might have grown because the journal seems to be really popular, so lots of people want to publish there, or they decided to expand to 6 issues a year rather than 4. So it can't account for any of that. Editorial practices can influence schools. So it has been known that editors request that certain articles from their own journal are cited, or they limit the number of citations. New journals have low scores, which means it's really hard for them to kind of get off the ground. It assumes short half-lives, so a half-life is the amount of time that research is supposed to kind of hang around in the literature. So in STEM subjects, you might think it's a very fast-paced moving field, so you're only ever going to cite papers that are kind of a maximum 2 years old, and then anything older than that's no longer relevant because the field's moved on. So it assumes that kind of short half-life, whereas that's not true for a lot of subjects. And certainly, in my case, I did archaeology, and I was citing papers from the 70s and 80s quite happily. And it's not really calculated for arts and humanities journals. So again, it's focused on the STEM. So there are some alternatives to the journal impact factor that have fewer of these problems. And they've been designed in a way to try and kind of overcome some of the limitations of the journal impact factor. So the two of them I'm just going to mention, the eigenfactor and the Scimago journal rank. So they measure citation structure, so they're looking at where the citation comes from, as well as just the number of citations. And the kind of quotes of what they use for come from themselves, so the total importance to the scientific community versus the scientific influence of scholarly journals, whatever those mean. And they're calculated in slightly different ways. Network analysis and iterative algorithm, they're called. I think there are links to the bit.ly document that I created. There should be links so you can go away and read a bit more on how they're calculated. But it's a lot more complicated than just doing the simple counting up the number of citations and citable items. So the bottom table there just shows you the top 5 journals in zoology in 2015 for the impact factor, the eigenfactor, and the SJR. And so you can see how different the numbers are. First of all, they kind of come out with different types of scores, and then you can see there are differences within the table as well. So each of them ranks a different journal at number 1. Some of them feature journals that the other table doesn't feature. So different journals produce different scores because they're looking at different ways, and there isn't one that's better than another. And also another thing to look at, which I always think is interesting, is kind of the actual number values and the difference between, say, 1 and 5. So, for example, in the eigenfactor score, you can see the ranking of number 1 and 2, they both have the same score, and so do 3 and 4. And actually there's not that much difference in between them. So when you're thinking about, is the top ranked journal better than the second ranked journal and the third ranked journal, if you actually try and look at the difference between the two scores and see how much of a difference there is, because it could be that actually they're very, very close and there's not much in it as well. So the ranking is almost a little bit arbitrary. So I'll just kind of go through the pros and cons of this kind of alternatives to the impact factor. So they do adjust for article half-life difference across the disciplines. So they do factor in this disciplinary difference about how long research stays around in the literature. They use longer term citation data, so typically 5 years. And if the journal size grows, it can still track the quality, so actually it avoids that problem that I was explaining earlier with the impact factor, where if the journal grows because it's good for its business model, the impact factor might plummet. So it accounts for that. And it includes both STEM and HAS journals, which is great because we should cater for all disciplines. And they're specifically designed for journal ranking, unlike the impact factor. So some cons, again, editorial practice can still influence scores. So editors can try and make sure that their own journal is cited. Skip on. And new journals have low scores again. So again, things take time to get off the ground and get going, and that doesn't mean that we should discount them as having rubbish research or not very good. It just means that they need time to build up their reputation within the academic community, and then to get people reading them and citing them. So, citation analysis I'm going to move on to next. So this might be something you're a bit more familiar with. It's a little less complicated than things like the impact factor and the eigenfactor. So what does it measure? It's basically the number of times an article is cited by others. And it's used as a kind of indication of the researcher's quality or impact. So a straightforward, if people read it and cite it, then it must be good. And if they do it lots, it must be really good. And it's calculated simply by counting the citations. So there's a nice easy way of finding citation index or analysis, and that's on Google Scholar. It's probably the easiest way to do it. And it kind of lists all the publications. So this is my lovely boss, Dr. Danny Kingsley, who happens to be sitting behind me. So we can see all her papers there. And you can quite easily see the number of times it's cited, and I'll break it down for you as well and tell you the number since 2011. Now, there are different ways you might look at citation scores. You might also do it on things like Scopus or Web of Science, and that's fine, and it'll probably give you a really different number. So certainly if I look at my own citation scores on Google Scholar and then compare it to something like Web of Science is always a lot lower than Google Scholar, and that's because they're counting citations from different sources. So things like Web of Science will look at all my citations within the journal's indexes in Web of Science, whereas Google Scholar just trawls the entire internet looking for citations of your work. So Google Scholar will pick up citations in things like master's and PhD theses that are shared online, or in book chapters, whereas things like Scopus Web of Science won't. So there are differences in numbers. And so if you're using citation analysis, it's really important to make it clear where you're getting those numbers from. So I'm going to talk about the H-index next, which is a metric that can be used to look at the researcher. And it's supposed to measure the productivity of a researcher, the citation impact of their publications. So it can actually also be applied to a journal or a group of scientists, but it's most commonly applied to individuals. And it's used as an indication of that researcher's impact or quality. And it's calculated by looking at the number of papers a researcher has and the number of times each paper has been cited. So the papers are ranked from the highest number of citations to lowest, just like we saw in Danny's Google Scholar page. And the H-index is calculated by looking at the last position where the rank is higher than the number of citations. So if we look at Danny's Google Scholar page, we can see that her papers have been ranked number 1 to 8 and onwards down the page. And if we look at the number of times it's been cited, we can see that the top ranked paper has been cited more than once. Number 2 has been cited more than 2 times. The third ranked paper has been cited more than 3 times, and so on and so forth, until you get to number 8, where actually it's only been cited 7 times. So Danny's H-index is in fact number 7, because that's the last point where the rank is lower than the number of citations. So, pros and cons of the H-index. Well, it's quite a simple process. Hopefully you can all go away and work it out now without the aid of Google Scholar telling you in the right-hand corner. It's quite easy to use, hopefully easy to explain. It includes non-traditional outputs, although not all. So if you're working with researchers in the arts and humanities, for instance, it means you can include things like their book chapters. And it's used to gauge career progression, so your H-index should go up and up as your career goes on and on. And so you can use it to kind of compare, how you've been going over the years. So there are some cons. It's subject specific, so you'd never expect someone in the arts and humanities to have as many citations probably as someone in the sciences. So the STEM subjects, typically people have higher H-indexes than people in the arts and humanities. So it can be quite good when you're comparing STEM versus STEM, because you can look at the stage the person's in their career and their H-index to see how well cited their work's been. But if you're using it to compare someone in the STEM subjects in the arts and humanities, it can be a bit more difficult. There's an age bias, so the longer you've been around, the higher it should be. It's not always true. And so if you have been around longer, it should be higher. And so you do need to take that into account, that you shouldn't be comparing an early career researcher with maybe like a senior professor. As I was saying, there's questionable usage outside of STEM subjects because the H-index can actually be really, really small. You're talking maybe numbers of like kind of 3, 4, 5, Danny's is 7, whereas STEM subjects are kind of talking like the 10s, 20s, 30s. It disregards the authorship position. So you could be the first author who's written most of the paper, you could be the last author or the kind of senior person on that paper, or you could be author kind of sat in the middle of a paper that has 20 authors and all you did was, I don't know, draw a graph using Excel, or you might have put some samples in a machine or something like that. So you didn't really necessarily have much input into the actual paper. So it doesn't take any of that into account. And it cannot decrease with time. So it's supposed to kind of gauge your productivity, but it can't really gauge that drop-off in productivity unless you're, I guess, tracking it over time. But still, your older papers are probably likely to get more and more cited, especially if they're kind of seminal methodological type of papers. So, a few more considerations about bibliometrics before I move on to altmetrics. There's a citation culture, so we need to think about how different disciplines cite other works. Self-citation's a problem, so you might be trying to kind of bump up your citation index, so you might cite yourself. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be citing yourself, because often you're building off your old research, so citing your previous studies can be a good thing, but people can do it just to try and bump up their own metrics. Different databases will give different results, so as I was giving the example with the citation analysis there. It encourages lazy evaluation if we just use metrics to assess research. Because, really we should be judging the quality of the research by reading the papers, but obviously no one has time to do all of that. But we should be aware that there are bigger factors other than metrics. And as I was saying earlier, some US universities are using metrics to help make hiring decisions. It doesn't take into account the influence of the research outside of the academic community. So it might be that actually the piece of research has led to a policy change, or it's led to the adoption of a new practice in something like educational or a health field, but actually none of this is taken into account. So when we're thinking about using metrics for impact and ref, metrics can give you one side of the story. It can tell you about the impact it's had probably within the academic community itself, because we're talking about academics citing other academics, but it's not going to tell you about what influence and impact it's had outside of the community. And seminal papers can skew the results, so you can write one paper that everyone refers to and is constantly cited, and that will really skew the results because it's not necessarily the most groundbreaking research in the world. It might just be that you came up with the protocol for doing this experiment, and everyone refers back to you. Open access papers are easier to get hold of, so it generally means that they're cited more, and there is a citation advantage to being open access, so actually that can also skew the figures as well. And then finally, review articles are often cited into the primary research, especially when the editors are trying to influence scores. If they limit the number of papers that you can reference, it's quite good to, you can strip out, 10 papers and put in one review article instead. And therefore, review articles can get cited and they get higher citations, and again, it can skew the results. So that's just something else to be aware of. Okay, so that's kind of ends the traditional bibliometrics side of things. I'm going to talk about altmetrics next. If anyone's got any questions about bibliometrics, please feel free to write in the chat box. If not, I'll just keep ploughing on. I'm sorry I'm not doing any more polls. I'm a bit unprepared this morning. So I'm going to spend the next half of the webinar talking about altmetrics and what they are. So, altmetrics are a way of measuring non-traditional forms of impact, and so they're seen as complementary to traditional bibliometrics. Is anyone, I'll ask a question, here we go for the chat box. Is anyone familiar with altmetrics, or have used them or seen them being used before? Oh, we've seen the donut, excellent. Everyone loves the donut. So I'll talk about the donut is an altmetric.com thing, so I'll be talking about that in a bit. Okay, and so people have had a look at it but not really made much use of it. So hopefully this section will explain a bit more about altmetrics and then how you might make use of the tools that are available to us here at the university. So as I was saying, it's quite complementary to traditional bibliometrics. So we've got the things like the journal impact factor, citation counts, H-index, number of publications, and then we kind of marry it together with the altmetrics. So these are the alternative ones. So mentions in news reports, references in policy, mentions on social media, Wikipedia references, things like that. So this, if we think about scholarship today and even just kind of general life today, everything's going digital, we're all online. And so altmetrics is really trying to recognise that and to give some kind of value to the online discussions that are going on around research. So this is pretty old data now. This is 2.5 years old, and I apologise I didn't have time to update this all. But each day, scholarly articles are receiving about 44,000 mentions, new mentions across social media, news and blogs. Okay, so there's this huge discourse about research, academic research going on online. And so that's one mention every 2 seconds, which is a lot. And those mentions range from really complex to quick shares to comprehensive reviews. So it might be someone's tweeting something in 140 characters, or someone's writing a really long news piece or a blog paper about the research. And as university staff, we have access to Altmetric Explorer for institutions, and on the clickable document there should be a nice link to Altmetric. I think they have updated their interface since I put these slides together. So if you go on Altmetric and it doesn't quite look like the slides I'm showing you, that will be why. And again, I profusely apologise for that. So when I talk about altmetrics for the kind of rest of the talk, I'm generally referring to altmetric.com, so this resource that the university has access to. There are other altmetric providers, so one of them is called Plum Analytics. It's kind of the big competitor. So it might be that if you move to a different university, you might have access to another provider. They all kind of try and do roughly the same thing, but again, everything I'm going to talk about is kind of more specific to altmetric.com. So they track a variety of data sources when they're trying to find mentions of academic research. So things like news outlets, social media and blogs, post-publication kind of peer review sites where people assess and talk about research after a publication, reference managers, it can see how many people have kind of added it to their database. It looks at other sources like Wikipedia, YouTube. It did look at things like Pinterest, and it tracked that for a while and then stopped tracking it because it decided it was not of any interest, or wasn't, not enough people were using it in that kind of way. It also looks at policy documents, so it kind of trawls a lot of known sources of policy documents looking for mentions. So how are the scores calculated? This is where they use their lovely little donut. But generally, there's a weighted count of the attention received by each research output. So a mention in a newspaper is worth more than a mention in a blog, which in turn is worth more than a tweet, which in turn is worth more than a retweet, and things like that. And they put a lot of thought into the weightings, and so different news outlets might score differently. So for example, they track both things like The Times and BuzzFeed, and I would personally never go to BuzzFeed for a source of serious news, but I probably would go to The Times, and so they reflect that in their weightings. And what can all of this kind of score tell you? So Altmetric, as Lucy was saying, they package this little score into their nice little donut, and so it's visually eye-catching. But what does it tell you? Well, it tells you about the type of attention the researchers are receiving, which countries are engaging with it, because it doesn't just track English language sources, it also tracks lots of foreign language sources to try and get away from the kind of North America, I guess UK bias that there is in research. If the article has influenced policies, new researcher engaged in the audience, you can pick this all up from Altmetrics, and you can also, if you delve deep enough, tell if the reaction is positive or negative. That's a little harder to do because you're just looking at score initially. So if you just take the score on face value, you can't necessarily tell if that is a good or a bad reaction. You can just tell that there's been some kind of reaction to the research. And you have to delve in a little bit deeper, which you can do using Altmetric. You can go and see a list of all the different tweets and news stories, that kind of thing. So you can go and really see who's talking about it and what they're saying. So I've realised this is the point in my slideshow where I usually give an example. So let me work out how I can share my screen, and I will try and share my screen. Okay, so there's your lovely Moodle course. So if we go to altmetric.com, hopefully you can all see this. If not, just write something in the chat. And you can go to the Explorer login up here. No one's putting anything in the chat, so I'm assuming you can see my screen. You can either log in, you can set up your own kind of login with your @cam address, which means that you can save different searches you might do, which can be really useful, or you can just continue as a guest if you're on a network computer. And this is what Altmetric looks like. So this is all research outputs from the University of Cambridge that have an Altmetric score that they've ever tracked. So you can see an overview on the right hand side here that there are 654,000 mentions of 187,000 outputs. And there are 15 different sources of attention that have been tracked. You can do advanced searches up here. So you can search for an author. I tell students it's always really fun to look up your supervisor and see if anyone is talking about their research. You of course can do that with all the senior professors in your department or whatever you like. You can look up a specific publisher if that's what you're interested in, or a journal. You can look up a department. You can look up a specific title of an output if you've got a paper in mind. And this is something that's Altmetric have introduced, I guess, in the last 6 months or so. You can actually look up the different types of output. So they first of all were just doing this for articles, but now they also do it for data sets, books, clinical trial records, book chapters, news stories. So there's actually, you can really drill down and make it quite useful for different subjects. And you can also search by a kind of time frame. So I'm going to look for archaeology because that's my subject. And I'm going to have a look at, I don't know, last, what's that, 6 months or so. I'm going to search, and it tells me all the papers that have had a mention, that were published in the last 6 months and had a mention. So there's quite a few there. You can see there are ones with really high scores and there are ones with really low scores. That's not to say the ones with low scores are bad. My papers, I think, have scores of like 4, so I'm quite happy with that. But it's these ones that have really high scores, and you can see the different colours of the donut. So we'll just have a look at that quickly. There's all the details. It tells you down here, it breaks down the different scores by the colours, so we can see it's been in news outlets, blogs, it's had loads of Twitter action, that kind of thing. You can see Twitter demographics of where it's in, where in the world they're talking about it, which can be really interesting if the research has a geographical focus. You can see the scoring context, so actually you can see how this ranks alongside other papers. So you can see that it scores at number 20,000 out of 8 million outputs in altmetrics, but you can see outputs of a similar age, it scores quite highly. Outputs of a similar age from the same journal, it scores quite highly again. So that can give you some kind of context of the scores. And again, you can use the tabs at the top to look specifically about who's talking about the paper, so you can see the different news sources and the different languages, again, which can be quite interesting if there's a geographical focus. You can look at the blogs, and you can have a look at who's tweeting things, whether they're retweets. And I always find it quite interesting, especially ones with the low scores, to see who's tweeting about it. Is it the authors? Is it their journals? Personally, I'm really pleased that one of my papers has a score of like 4 because it's had 4 tweets and only one of them was from one of the authors. Come on. So that's quite nice. Right, so I'm going to attempt to stop sharing my screen and go back to the webinar. So, how do I get rid of this? Hide. Hopefully, can you see my presentation again? Yes, brilliant. Thank you very much. So there's an example of how you kind of navigate, might use it. There are also altmetric for books. So this was introduced kind of then last year, and you can use that interface to search for books and the score about books. But you can also see it, say, on publishers' websites. So you can see an example here from Routledge, where they have the altmetric score just on the left-hand side, and you can also see it for each chapter, so you can drill down by chapter and look at the different scores for some books. So I will summarise the pros and cons. I realise I haven't actually told you how altmetric finds these mentions, and that is through the DOI. So if a paper or a book chapter has a DOI or another unique identifier, so something like a PubMed ID, altmetric kind of trawls the internet for a mention of that ID, and if it finds it, then it gets a mention. If you're just using something like the URL, then that won't necessarily count. So it's always important I think, to stress to researchers who might be tweeting or talking about research, or if you're doing it yourself, to try and remember to use the DOI. So there are some pros of altmetrics. One, that it gives evidence for funders that research is having some kind of socio-economic impact outside of academia. You can use it for impact case studies for the ref, so especially if we're thinking about policy studies or policy adoption, it could be really nice in that regard. It might provide networking opportunities, so because you can see who's talking about your research, it might kind of give you an opening to go and talk to someone at a conference, say. It's good for promoting your research group, so if you can get everyone doing it, then you can really kind of make a splash or get yourselves known. And it means you can disseminate your research much more widely. So if you're putting it out there and you're making it available, making people kind of aware of it, then more people are gonna read it. There are some cons. So I was saying before, I can't tell you anything about quality unless you're prepared to really drill down into the mentions and have a look. There are subject-specific behavioural practices, so some subjects are already much better than others about talking about their work or public engagement or writing for blogs or kind of pushing it out to news channels. So it might be that the STEM subjects are much more heavily represented in altmetrics. And it doesn't pick up all sources, so it picks up a lot but not everything. So for example, they don't pick up the Russian version of Facebook, I've forgotten what it's called, because they're not allowed to. So it might be that if someone's working in Russia or writing in Russian, that actually there's a lot of attention going on about that paper through things like Russian social media, but actually altmetric isn't picking that up, so we can't necessarily know the impact that that's having online. So, as I was saying, it can't tell you anything about quality unless you're prepared to drill down. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be funny. And this is my favourite example because I'm completely juvenile of the top 15 tweeted papers in biomedicine published between 2010 and 2002. And if you look at that list, you can see that the top few all sound fairly serious and important and proper science, and then you get down to number 7 and it's an article called penile fracture seems more likely during sex under stressful situations. And I mean, it might have been extremely high quality research, I'm not going to doubt that, but I'm going to guess people were tweeting about it because of the seriousness of the research. They were probably giggling like my colleague is next to me. So, metrics. How might academics use metrics, first of all? So they might use it on deciding where to publish, on assessing articles written by others, demonstrating to funders' employers the value of their research. They might use it within their profile, so they might want to put it on their departmental webpage. As I was saying, they might use it for the ref and performance analysis, so see who's doing well and deciding who to hire. So there are kind of tools that can help them do these things. So one of them is altmetric bookmarklet, can really help them to easily assess research articles without having to go into the main altmetric interface. And then things like their Symplectic account and their ORCID can help them with putting on profiles and using it for ref and kind of centralizing that. So the altmetric bookmarklet, it's something that you can really easily install into your browser. There should be a link on the clickable document, and all you kind of have to do is drag and drop something into your browser. Even I can do it, and I'm not very good at technology. And simply when you're looking at a journal website or a kind of article page, you can just go into your bookmarks and you say altmetric it, and the little donut kind of pops up in the top right corner of your screen. And then you can click on that for more details, but you can get a really kind of quick and easy idea of have people been talking about this paper. So altmetrics also shown in Symplectic. So researchers might use this as a really easy and quick way to find out their own metric scores. So this is an example from my publication page, and you can see I've got a metric score of 3. I'm quite pleased with that. It's just a kind of quick, easy way to look at things. So I'm going to be completely honest here. I've forgotten why I've put an altmetrics and ORCID into my slideshow. Oh, I know why. It's come back to me. Thank goodness. Okay, altmetric also integrates with ORCID. So if you have an ORCID profile, and an author does, they have a big number here, and you can use that number to go into altmetric and to look up their scores. So this is the old interface. I apologise, I haven't updated it, but you can do this in the new one as well. So you can enter their ORCID ID into the box and you can find out all their publications. So that might be really useful if you're interested in the scores of a researcher, and they have a really common name, but they also have an ORCID ID. So it's not going to be much use searching for John Smith in altmetric.com, but if John Smith has an ORCID ID, you can put that in instead and you can find all his papers nice and easy. So finally, how might librarians use metrics? So these are some ideas I had about how you might use metrics. You might have others, and hopefully you'll share them with each other. So you might want to use it to monitor the articles in your department. So if you're responsible or you like to blog about research that's going on, or kind of try and use social media to help promote the research in the department, you might find altmetrics a really useful way to do that. So you could set up, if you kind of create yourself an account and log in, you can make a search, and you can go back and refresh that search every week to try and find out what papers have been talked about this week or something. And you might use that as a kind of regular way to advertise research or see what's been published and what's making a splash. You might also be interested in using altmetrics for kind of research, for looking at kind of wider things than just making kind of using it for promotional gain. There's something called Explorer for Publishers and Explorer for Academic Librarians. So this gives you more information about different publications that you can use in a way that might help you inform different decisions you make in the library. So it might be useful to see what journals people are reading, because you can see the different citations, that kind of thing. So how might you use metrics? Well, you can use it to promote best practice. So you could, especially with open access, I think, you can show that a paper's been made open access and it's got loads of citations. Or you can say, look, when we're talking about this paper, we cite the DOI because we're all into citing things properly. And if we cite the DOI, we get loads of mentions online, that kind of thing. But you also might use traditional bibliometrics and use that to promote best practice. So when we're thinking about journal impact factor or citation index, and you hear researchers talk about it, you also might want to tell them all the caveats that come with using those kind of metrics and encourage them to use a range of different metrics to assess research. You could help researchers understand what metrics mean. So I think especially in the STEM subjects, when people can get quite obsessed with the impact factor, you might take it upon yourselves to try and educate researchers. You might be fighting a losing battle with more senior academics, but hopefully with the younger crowd we can educate them into metrics and get them kind of out of this mindset where the journal impact factor is all or nothing, or you can educate different researchers into using it as a tool for helping them to pick where to publish, for example. You might just want to show them the resources that are available, so all the different ones that are out there. They might never have heard of altmetrics or seen that we have the Explorer. They might not know that we have access to different ways of looking at the impact factor or the impact or whatever it is. They might not know that symplectic exists, so you might want to show them that, and show them that as an easy way to look at their altmetric scores. And as I was saying before, you can use it to encourage researchers to use the open access service, because there is this citation advantage with the open access papers, and might be a good way to send people our way for open access. And I can't possibly do a talk without mentioning open access at all. So it might be just kind of a nice way to tie everything together. So I think that's all. That's just to say that next week, is the 18th of September, it's the copyright session. Hopefully Claire will be back with you and have a slightly more polished presentation. But thank you for putting up with me, and I hope you found it really useful. If you've got any questions, please let me know.